Gunfighter John Wesley Hardin was one of the most notorious killers of the Wild West. He is said to have killed more than 40 men throughout his criminal life. Son of a Methodist preacher, Hardin developed an explosive temperament from youth and began killing while still a teenager during the turbulent post-Civil War period in Texas. The painting Cowboys Coming to Town for Christmas, created by Frederick Remington in 1889. Remington was one of the most important painters of Wild West life, documenting cowboys, soldiers, and indigenous peoples with impressive detail and accuracy. This work captures the festive and rustic spirit of cowboys riding into town for the holidays. A rider fills his water barrel at a desert well 30 miles north of Palomas, Arizona, while his horse refreshes nearby in 1907. This everyday scene captures the harsh reality of life in the arid American Southwest, where water was the most precious resource and every stop at a well was vital for survival on the open desert. Miles City, Montana, in 1881, the year the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad transformed the town forever. Miles City became an important cattle market in Montana and remains so to this day, more than a century later. The railroad accelerated the city's development and effectively ended the era of the great cattle drives. A Tlingit woman from Alaska, named Cow Claw, wearing her potlatch dance regalia, photographed in Alaska in 1906. The Tlingit people inhabited the Alaskan coast for millennia. The potlatch was and remains a fundamental ceremony of wealth redistribution and social affirmation in the indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest. The Long Branch Saloon was one of the most famous saloons in Dodge City, Kansas, photographed between 1874 and 1885. It had several owners over the years, primarily Chalk Beeson and William Harris. Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson were regular patrons. It became immortalized in the Gunsmoke television series from 1955 to 1975. Judge Roy Bean's saloon, called the Jersey Lily, in Langtry, Texas, around 1900. Bean called himself the Law West of the Pecos and served as a justice of the peace using highly unorthodox methods. He named his saloon after British actress Lily Langtry, of whom he was an avowed fan, though he never actually met her. On July 26, 1889, settlers Ella Watson and James Averill were murdered by Wyoming cattlemen. Watson, nicknamed Cattle Kate, had accepted stolen cattle as payment for services. The large ranchers, who viewed small settlers as a threat, lynched both without trial and were never prosecuted for the killings. View of hydraulic gold mining operations in southwestern Oregon around 1890. Hydraulic mining used powerful water jets to erode entire hillsides, exposing gold deposits. Although extremely efficient, it caused large-scale environmental devastation, silting rivers, and destroying entire habitats across the mountain landscape. View of Canyon de Chelly in Arizona in 1873. This historical image, taken just 5 years after the return of the Navajo from their forced exile at Bosque Redondo, documents the landscape the Diné reclaimed for themselves. Canyon de Chelly, with its red sandstone walls reaching up to 300 meters, remains sacred to the Navajo. A sandstorm sweeps through Midland, Texas in 1894. Sandstorms, also called haboobs, were constant threats on the arid plains of Texas and New Mexico. This dramatic image captures the awesome power of the natural forces that Wild West settlers faced, in addition to the human dangers of life on the frontier. The painting Indian Ghost Dance, before the Battle of Wounded Knee, created in 1891. The Ghost Dance was a spiritual movement that promised the resurrection of the dead and the restoration of the indigenous world. The U.S. government banned the practice, and its conflict with authorities resulted in the Wounded Knee Massacre of December 1890. Studio portrait of an indigenous woman with the extraordinary name of Takes a Prisoner Blackbird from the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana. This formal portrait, with its evocative name, documents the cultural diversity and complexity of identities among the indigenous nations of northern Montana in the late 19th century. Sand dunes in the Carson Desert, Nevada, photographed in 1867 during a geographical survey expedition. The Carson Desert in western Nevada was one of the most feared obstacles for pioneers crossing the Great Basin Desert toward California, especially during the hot and arid summer season that stretched for long months. William Frederick Cody, Buffalo Bill, photographed in 1887. This mid-career photograph shows Buffalo Bill at the height of his fame during the years when his Wild West show was thrilling audiences in the United States and Europe. Cody was one of the most recognizable men in the Western world during this remarkable period. Bill Tilghman, Marshal of Dodge City in the early 1880s and later Chief of Police of Oklahoma City, photographed during his buffalo hunting days alongside Bat Masterson, who recruited him for law enforcement. Tilghman was one of the longest-lived lawmen of the Wild West, dying in the line of duty at age 70. Texas Jack Jr., son of the legendary Texas Jack Omohundro, in recently discovered photographs. Texas Jack Jr. followed his father into the entertainment world and was one of the first to give Will Rogers his big break in show business. These photographs are rare documents of a little-known figure of the American Wild West. In late 1887, Calamity Jane Canary and cowboy Teddy Blue Abbott swapped hats in a Gilt Edge, Montana saloon. This unusual image captures a relaxed moment between two colorful Wild West characters who had known each other for years. Abbott later wrote important memoirs about the everyday life of American cowboys. Big Mike Goldwater, grandfather of U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater, prepares for a picnic with friends in Prescott, Arizona in 1880. The Goldwaters were Jewish merchants who settled in Arizona and prospered. This image captures the community of merchants and citizens who formed the backbone of Wild West towns. Soapy Smith in a saloon in Skagway, Alaska in 1898. Jefferson Randolph Smith II, known as Soapy Smith, was the greatest con man and crime boss in Skagway during the Klondike Gold Rush. He controlled the town with a gang of followers until he was killed in a duel in July 1898 by vigilante Frank Reed. Prisoners from Slim Buttes, 1876. The Battle of Slim Buttes, fought in September 1876 in the Black Hills of Dakota, was one of the first American victories after the disaster at Little Bighorn. General Crook attacked an Oglala Lakota village, capturing several warriors and beginning the campaign that would eventually break Sioux resistance. Buffalo Soldiers, troops of the 10th Cavalry Regiment, at Fort Apache, around 1890. The 10th Cavalry was one of the most decorated regiments in the American Army, serving in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and other frontier regions. Its soldiers, former enslaved people and sons of freedmen, were nicknamed Buffalo Soldiers by Cheyenne warriors. A cowboy with a cattle herd in Genesee, Kansas in 1902. By 1902, the great Texas cattle drives were already coming to an end, replaced by railroads and barbed wire fencing. This image captures the last breath of an era that had defined the American Wild West for 3 decades of romantic and often violent history. View of Dodge City in 1875. In that year, Dodge City was already the leading cattle trade center in the United States, but was still in the early years of its turbulent development. The town would grow rapidly in the following years, becoming both the largest cattle market and the most famous violent city in the Wild West. 2 men standing beside a cabin in northern Utah around the 1890s. This image captures the modest and isolated life of pioneer settlers who established themselves in Utah's most remote regions, far from the busier mining towns. Isolation was both a challenge and a form of freedom for many who sought a simpler life on the frontier. the equivalent of 15 days' worth of gold collected at Gold Run Creek in the Yukon around 1898. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 to 1899 attracted more than 100,000 people to the Canadian Yukon in search of wealth. This dramatic image of a pile of gold nuggets captures the dream that kept prospectors working in extreme conditions. A freight wagon typical of those Virgil and Wyatt Earp used to haul supplies across the Mojave Desert approaches Prescott in the Arizona Territory in a scene from around the 1870s. The Earp brothers made this journey before becoming famous, working as freight haulers across the arid and demanding American Southwest. View of Prescott in the Arizona Territory around 1880. Prescott was the first capital of the Arizona Territory, founded in 1864. It was a relatively orderly town by Wild West standards, with a community of merchants, professionals, and politicians attempting to build stable institutions on the demanding American frontier. A Pawnee scout in partial regalia, portrayed by William Henry Jackson in 1868. Jackson was one of the most important photographers in American history, documenting the West for various government expeditions. The Pawnee people inhabited the Nebraska plains and frequently served as allies of the American Army against the Lakota Sioux. Bat Masterson standing and Wyatt Earp seated, photographed in Dodge City in 1876. This rare photograph of the two legendary lawmen together captures the two figures who would define law and order in Dodge City during its most violent years. Masterson and Earp would remain close friends for the rest of their remarkably long lives. A Wild West man with a cross-draw revolver, a method of carrying the weapon with the grip facing forward in the holster on the opposite side from the shooting hand. The cross-draw was popular among horsemen as it made it easier to draw the gun while mounted. This image captures one of the varied firearm-carrying styles of the frontier. Navajo horsemen crossing Canyon de Chelly in Arizona in 1904. Canyon de Chelly, one of the most sacred places of the Navajo people, maintained its beauty and spiritual significance decades after the military campaigns that attempted to destroy Diné culture. This photograph captures the persistence of Navajo life and identity on the reservation. Wild Bill Hickok, photographed in 1867 when he was still relatively young and his fame as a gunfighter was just beginning to grow. Hickok had served as a scout during the Civil War and was building his reputation as one of the most skilled men with firearms in the American Wild West during this formative era. The photograph that led to the downfall of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. A lawman recognized the outlaws in the image and delivered it to the Pinkerton Agency. This group photograph was taken at a studio in Fort Worth and ended up being distributed as a wanted poster, precipitating Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid's flight to South America. Texas Jack Jr. in a digitally restored photograph. He was the son of the legendary Texas Jack Omohundro and gave Will Rogers his first major opportunity in the entertainment business. The digital restoration of this old photograph allows much clearer visualization of the features and costume details of this pioneer of Western shows. A man of the Ute tribe in the White Rocks Canyon area of Utah around 1900. The Uintah Ute were confined to the Uintah Reservation after the Treaty of 1861, losing most of their ancestral lands. White Rocks Canyon in northern Utah remains part of the Uintah and Ouray Reservation territory to the present day. Ham Bell's varieties in Dodge City around 1870. Ham Bell was one of Dodge City's first residents and merchants, operating as a cattle transporter and having direct contact with figures like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. Bell's varieties offered diverse entertainment for the mixed population of the famous frontier cattle town. On the outskirts of Dodge City, Kansas, in the early 1900s. By this time, Dodge City had left behind its most violent phase and was becoming a more established agricultural town. The frontier had been pushed westward, and the Kansas plains were now the domain of peaceful farmers and ranchers rather than outlaws and gunfighters. Cynthia Ann Parker and her daughter Prairie Flower photographed around 1861. Cynthia Ann had been captured by Comanche in 1836 at age 9 and fully integrated into Comanche culture. She married Chief Peta Nocona and had 3 children, including the future Great Chief Quanah Parker, the last free Comanche leader. Porter Rockwell, bodyguard to Brigham Young and one of the most feared lawmen in Mormon Utah. Rockwell was a fervent devotee who claimed never to have cut his hair as a religious vow of fidelity. He was called the Destroyer Angel by Mormons who admired his absolute loyalty, and the Porter of Hell by his many enemies. The hand of cards Wild Bill Hickok was holding when assassinated, aces of spades and clubs and 8s of spades and hearts, became known as the dead man's hand. This combination of aces and 8s became a cultural symbol of the Wild West and is still called by that name in poker games and popular culture today. Members of the Frontier Battalion, a company of the Texas Rangers, photographed around 1885. The Texas Rangers were the first and most famous police force of the state of Texas, established in 1823. During the 1880s and 1890s, Rangers were responsible for patrolling the vast Texas border with Mexico and tracking outlaws. A stuntman on the film set of Santa Fe Trail in 1941. This film starred Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan and depicted events from the pre-Civil War period in Kansas with considerable historical liberties. Hollywood productions about the Wild West were frequently more about myth-making than about actual historical accuracy or events. Joe Fowler was a notorious Wild West killer, rumored to have murdered between 30 and 40 people. He operated as a deputy sheriff while simultaneously using his position for criminal purposes. He was eventually lynched by a group of citizens tired of his brutality, a form of frontier justice that was common across the American West. A pioneer family in Loup Valley, Nebraska, in 1886. This photograph captures the familiar and domestic face of westward expansion, not the violence of gunfighters, but the everyday reality of families building new lives in Nebraska, facing storms, droughts, grasshopper plagues, and the profound isolation of the Great Plains. Esam Dart, African-American cowboy and bronco buster, photographed around the 1890s. Dart was one of the most skilled horse tamers in the West and worked on several ranches in Colorado and Wyoming. He was killed in 1900 by hired assassin Tom Horn in a dispute between large and small cattle ranchers over grazing lands. A Lakota man, photographed between 1895 and 1899 in South Dakota. This photograph captures a Lakota individual in the period immediately following the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, when the Sioux Nation faced increasing pressure to abandon their traditions and adopt the American way of life on the Dakota reservations. Charlie Bowdre and his wife Manuela, photographed around 1878. Bowdre was a member of Billy the Kid's Regulators during the Lincoln County War. He was killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett at Stinking Springs, New Mexico, in December 1880 during the capture of Billy the Kid and the last remaining members of the outlaw gang. Photograph of outlaw John Sontag, taken around June 11 to 12, 1893, when he had not yet died from his wounds. Sontag and Chris Evans led a gang that robbed several Southern Pacific Railroad trains in California. The photo was taken after a decisive confrontation with authorities that left Sontag mortally wounded. A group of cowboys at dinner time at the Ox Ranch, on the site where Childress, Texas stands today, around 1886. The Ox Ranch was one of the great Texas cattle operations that employed dozens of cowboys. Collective meals were one of the few moments of community and rest in the exhausting daily life of the working cowboy.